Greetings, fans of typography. What do you think? Can typefaces be political? Many people seem to believe so, and I'm actually personally affected by this. Because every time I digitize an old German blackletter font, someone accuses me of supporting or even having certain political views just because I dare to work with these typefaces in any way. So let's take this example of German blackletter fonts and explore whether typefaces can be political.
Depending on where you live, you may or may not know that today, blackletter fonts can indeed be used as a political symbol here in Germany. When utilized in a political context, the style of these typefaces evokes a visual connection to the 1930s, the time of the Nazi Party, and a time when blackletter fonts were still, and for the last time, in broad use in Germany. But professional font users, like graphic designers, usually know that blackletter fonts have been used all across Europe for hundreds of years, and their cultural heritage can therefore not be reduced to a use in a specific country or decade. And still, it's very common among professional font users in Germany to assume that the modern blackletter fonts created in the 1930s were either specifically made for a political use or that they were used by the Nazi Party to such an extent that they are now a taboo. In order to judge these claims, we have to consider all the typical ways in which a font can be linked to ideological concepts. And here they are. Connotation. A connection created by the frequent use of a typeface in a specific context. Intention. The goal of type designers or type foundries to see their typefaces in certain contexts. And finally, manifestation. The idea that the design of the letter forms itself expresses and therefore supports certain ideological concepts. Now let's look at each point separately. All creative and artistic work creates connotations. Imagine hearing a certain piece of music or looking at the picture of a building. It will tie in with things you have heard and seen before, evoke connotations, and you will instantly have at least a vague, if not specific idea about a time and region in the world to which this kind of music or architecture belongs to. The same is true for typefaces as well, and we usually deliberately choose typefaces based on the connotations they can potentially evoke. Connecting blackletter fonts to the German culture is certainly a possible associative connection, because in Germany, blackletter fonts remained in use longer than in any other part of the world, and many blackletter fonts were deliberately created for this market. In fact, there was even an established convention among German printers to use blackletter for German content and Roman typefaces for names and texts from abroad. This also meant that some people, for example in the 19th and early 20th century, would prefer and promote blackletter fonts in the context of patriotic and nationalist ideas, because blackletter type designs that were now mostly unique to the countries using the German language could potentially be seen as symbol and expression of the German culture. But it is a mistake trying to extrapolate from this possibility alone to an assessment about the general public perception of these typefaces, just like we could use the color green as an associative connection to symbolize nature. But that does not mean that every use of the color green will have that intention or create this perception. What seems to happen now is that people in Germany take today's rather strong associative connection between blackletter fonts and right-wing extremism, and they just assert that this perception must have existed in the same way in the 1930s in Germany, and based on this idea, every creation of such a font and every use of such a font during the 1930s then feels like a clear political statement, and this would be especially true for the modern German blackletter fonts released during the 1930s. These fonts didn't even exist before the 1930s, and after World War II, they came out of use along with all blackletter designs. As a result, the connotations created through the use of these typefaces are likely to be tied to the 1930s, the only time these typefaces were in broad use. The same is not true for other popular fonts used during the 1930s, like Futura, for example, which were used by the Nazi Party as well. But serif and sans serif fonts remained in broad use after the war, and this explains why our connotations in regards to these designs are not limited to just the 1930s, let alone individual contexts and use cases during that time. But for the German black-letter fonts of the 1930s, the connotations seem to actually become more and more narrow as time goes on, which is not a surprise. We have no way of experiencing the font use during the 1930s ourselves, and hardly anyone will study the thousands of books, newspapers, magazines, flyers and posters published during this decade in detail. If we see prints from Germany produced during the 1930s, chances are the topic at hand will be politics and Nazi Germany, and what we are being presented with is likely political propaganda from that time. And of course, this will shape our perception of the fonts and lettering styles used during that time. It can even become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where we keep cherry-picking prints from that time that feel typical. But our perception of what is typical is based on cherry-picked examples we have seen before. So it's no wonder that people will think that the typefaces used in this context are made for this context, when it appears to be the only context in which these fonts are being used. But as explained, this might be based on a skewed view of history. Whoever studies the printed matter from that time in more detail will quickly find out that the modern black-letter fonts of the 1930s were just that, modern fonts. They were used whenever a modern appeal was needed, for example for advertising purposes. This could include political ads, but the use was by no means limited to this context or even typical for that context. In fact, multiple works in the field of cultural studies have investigated the role of typography for the Nazi Party. The authors all came to the same conclusion. The Nazi Party did not have a homogeneous strategy for dealing with questions around the use of typefaces, and the use of fonts in their own printed matter was also far from homogeneous. And the evidence shows that the people of the time didn't saw a strong connotation between blackletter and nationalism either. This is evident by looking at how broad the spectrum of font use was during that time, and it becomes even more obvious when we look at the font use of different political parties. Left-wing parties and publications were using old and modern black-letter fonts all the time. Would there have been a strong connotation linking these fonts to right-wing politics, left-wing publishers would have avoided these fonts, but they did not. And the Nazi propaganda would have used black-letter almost exclusively, but that also wasn't the case. The Nazis used typefaces from across all sorts of type styles. In conclusion, the strong associative connection between black-letter and right-wing extremism that exists today in Germany did not exist in the same way in the 1930s, and even if it did, connotations created by the use of a typeface do not describe an intrinsic property. It makes very little sense to judge type styles or type designers and foundries just based on selected use cases that are out of the control of the people creating the fonts. Just like we wouldn't blame monotype when a political party would start to print everything in Helvetica. For a stronger case against these black-letter fonts, there would need to be some kind of intent on the side of the type designers and the type foundries. So were the modern black-letter typefaces of the 1930s intended to be used for Nazi propaganda? It's easy to see how people could believe that. One just needs to look at a few cherry-picked examples of type specimens with a somewhat patriotic message and then look at cherry-picked Nazi propaganda using letterforms in that style. It could easily feel like a demonstration of intent, but correlation does not prove a causal connection. First of all, it's important to stress that font production and font use have changed a lot in the last 100 years. Today, graphic designers can easily purchase a font just for a specific project, and it's common that companies and organizations have a corporate design and always use the same fonts. But 100 years ago, type foundries only sold their fonts to print shops, and these print shops had to offer a selection of different styles to whichever customer might come next. Creating new fonts was a tedious and expensive process for the foundries, and buying font families was a significant investment for the print shops. Focusing on the narrow use case of a single party's political use made little sense for print shops or type foundries. A broad and versatile use was always favourable. The original foundry-type specimens prove the kind of use the foundries had in mind. There was never a focus on just a political use. What was being advertised were modern and versatile type families for product logos and advertisements, event posters, letterheads, books, newspapers, magazines, and so on, and that's exactly how these fonts were actually being used. But people just don't get to see most of these uses nowadays. Where would you come across prints from that time unless it's in a political context? It's just too rare to influence the public perception. When we are discussing intent, it's also useful to research who the designers of these fonts were. And here is just one example. A well-known type design in this category of modern black-letter fonts of the 1930s is Berthold Wolper's Sachsenwald. Born into a Jewish family in Germany, Wolper had to emigrate to England soon after the Nazis came to power. In England, he then finished and published his design. Had this type style been understood as a visual expression of Nazi ideology at the time, why would he have ever wanted to design it, let alone finish and publish it after he had to flee Nazi Germany? It's also worth mentioning that there is no known direct connection between the Nazi Party and the German font foundries during the 1930s. The Nazis didn't even pick a typeface, let alone commission a typeface to represent their party. That would have been something that might justify the idea of a Nazi font. The Nazi Party also didn't put font foundries under state control or regulate which fonts were allowed to be released during the 1930s. This only changed in the 1940s when the Nazis essentially outlawed blackletter by declaring Roman fonts to be the new standard. So it is somewhat ironic that blackletter is now seen as a Nazi symbol when the Nazis themselves forced an end to the broad use of blackletter. Connotations can be quite powerful. If someone is used to see these modern blackletter fonts of the 1930s only in the context of Nazi propaganda, then everything about that context can be evoked by just looking at the letter forms. And based on this experience, it's not such a big leap to assume that the political ideology itself must somehow be visually embedded in the letter forms. And that has become a common assertion here in Germany after World War II. People rightfully despise the Nazi ideology, and then they also despise the typefaces they think they can link to that time. As a result, the modern blackletter fonts aren't just described as extremely ugly, but derogatory adjectives which might fit the ideology are also applied to the fonts of the 1930s, as if those descriptions were objective evaluations of design qualities. But the people who make these judgments will usually struggle when asked to explain how these characteristics are actually embedded in the letter forms. It usually boils down to the supposed bold and dark appearance of these typefaces and their angular, simplified appearance, two features which are then claimed to be a deliberate visual expression of Nazi ideology. But is that even possible? Think about it. Let's say we start with an existing letter. Now imagine to change or redraw this letter to express a specific ideology, capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever it might be. It almost feels like an absurd task. No version of a stem or serif or letter skeleton can directly say communism, because ideas about how to build societies are too complex to be expressed in the way you draw a line with a pencil or write with a broad nib pen. Unless you start adding pictographic elements to the letters, political concepts just cannot be expressed this way. Which is not to say that typefaces specifically designed for an ideology cannot exist. An actual example is anthroposophy, a pseudo-scientific movement proposing a kind of spiritual world we have access to. The movement has its own architectural style and its own type style, where letters are drawn in a way that is supposedly more organic. But still, what we are seeing is not an expression of the actual ideological concepts because they are too abstract and too complicated to be expressed through letter forms. Instead, we are dealing with connotations. One has to see these fonts over and over again in the context of the ideology to learn the connection between the design principles and the ideology. In fact, if someone would have never seen these fonts in this specific context, we could easily take these fonts, use them repeatedly in a completely different context, and create the same kind of connection. But then, why do the modern black-letter fonts of the 1930s look the way they do if they don't express a political ideology? The design is actually not that hard to explain. It simply follows the modernization of the sans-serif typefaces during the 1920s that happened around schools like the Bauhaus and movements such as the so-called New Typography. This movement is the source of the font style category Geometric Sans, and it is characterized by trying to simplify the sans-serif letterforms as much as possible. By the end of the 1920s and in the early 1930s, designers in Germany also attempted to apply these ideas to black-letter fonts. Drawing a connection between the modernization of sans-serif fonts in the 1920s and the modernization of black-letter fonts in the 1930s is not just an assertion. The designers and foundries clearly explained this connection in their type specimens and other publications. And interestingly, most of these modern black-letter fonts do not even start with the typical German black-letter design style of the time called Fraktur. Instead, the modern black-letter fonts from the 1930s draw their inspiration from the early textura letterforms created at a time when black-letter split off from the Roman letterforms. Using this early black-letter style wouldn't have made much sense as a political statement, since the textura style is not directly linked to the German culture like the Fraktur style is. But it made perfect sense as a pragmatic design choice, because a simplified and therefore modernized textura style bridges the gap between Roman and black-letter fonts and creates legible modern typefaces. But none of the characteristics of these fonts can easily be linked to political ideas. A modernized textura isn't a political statement, nor is the black-letter category as a whole. A dark and supposedly intimidating appearance isn't a characteristic feature of this type style as some would like to claim, and even if it were, the same would then apply to other type styles as well. Fat fonts have been used at least since the rise of advertising typefaces in the 19th century. So why should a fat black-letter typeface be a political statement when a fat typeface in any other style would not receive the same judgment? And why should it be an expression of a political ideology to simplify black-letter letterforms, while at the same time Bauhaus graphic designers are celebrated for creating simplified sans-serif designs during the 1920s? In fact, the Bauhaus designers took the idea of constructed letterforms so much further than the designers of modern black-letter fonts. The modern black-letter fonts are at least still in line with a calligraphic tradition and can be written with a broad nib pen. It's also useful to look at the perception of fonts under different fascist regimes. Prints from the time of fascism in Italy didn't use black-letter fonts, but modern geometric sans-serif fonts or lettering in this style. And again, in hindsight, some people started to associate this design style with fascism. This too demonstrates that it's a learned connection, not an intrinsic feature of the design, and not a manifestation of political ideas expressed through type design choices. Looking at the evidence, namely the original type specimens and the font use during the 1930s, most of the typical claims around these modern black-letter fonts cannot be substantiated. The idea that these fonts were meant to be used for political propaganda. The idea that these fonts were designed to express Nazi ideology. Not even the idea that these fonts were heavily and predominantly used by the Nazi Party and should therefore now be a taboo. Instead, we are mostly dealing with connotations, an associative, learned connection that for the most part actually started after World War II and got stronger over time. This is important to understand because it means that the political connection isn't a fact about the past, but a product of the present era. In other words, we are the ones causing it and controlling it through the way we talk about these fonts and through the way we use these fonts, and this even includes the decision to avoid these fonts. That too can have an effect. When we don't use certain typefaces or type styles because of connotations they could possibly evoke, then these typefaces will only be used by the ones who specifically want to evoke these connotations, and this leads to even stronger political connotations and even more avoidance. It becomes a vicious circle. So maybe these fonts should actually be used more, not less, not as a political statement, but as a way to counter a potential political appropriation. So can fonts be political? Well, probably not in the way that many people seem to think. Intrinsic design features of a typeface or type style can hardly ever be linked to ideological concepts. Of course, typefaces can express certain characteristics. They can look elegant, traditional, playful, futuristic, serious, friendly, and so on. But there is no way to draw a communistic letter or capitalist letter or a fascist letter. Calling a font racist is like calling a color racist just because people with racist ideas have started to use a specific color to represent their movement or organization. If one thinks that colors can't be racist, one also shouldn't think that typefaces can be racist. Speaking of racist fonts, Nazi fonts and so on suggests a much stronger direct connection than one that is just caused by connotations. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be advisable to know the connotations the fonts we use can evoke and to consider all pros and cons of evoking these connotations. But what is actually achieved by condemning and avoiding certain fonts just based on assumed political connotations? If anything, it supports the political appropriation of these fonts. The harm of fascism, racism, and so on need to be understood and need to be countered with education. Declaring fonts taboo and judging people who do not follow this taboo will not solve anything.